Authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on examining the Council of Environmental Quality fiscal year 2024 budget request and related policy matters. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and again, thank you for joining us for this full committee hearing examining the Council on Environmental Quality's budget request and policy issues. I'd especially like to thank Chair Mallory for being here today to testify on behalf of CEQ. This is the first time we've been able to hear from you in person here on the committee, and I know we all have lots of questions about the work of CEQ and programs your agency has implemented under the Biden administration. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with CEQ, this is an agency that was originally established as part of the National Environmental Policy Act as part of an effort to remedy some ongoing ecological issues that quite honestly would be unrecognizable today. It's safe to say the world is now vastly different than it was in the early 1970s, and our environmental safeguards have grown tenfold. And I would say that the work of the CEQ in the past with administrations has been part of that solution to getting NEPA implemented and getting a much better environment in place in the United States that we experience today. But at the same time, this does call into question what is the modern purpose of CEQ. President Biden has transformed the once small staff from their core mission of ensuring NEPA compliance into a legion of people implementing social change and eco-justice initiatives across the federal government. CEQ's own chief of staff has described the responsibilities and powers bestowed upon the agency by President Biden as unprecedented. In many ways, CEQ has acted as the enforcers for every anti-energy and unscientific eco-agenda that President Biden has prioritized via executive order. The explosive growth of CEQ's mission and bureaucratic morass is mirrored in the dramatic rise of their budget. From 2019 to 2023, CEQ's baseline budget more than doubled. On top of that, CEQ received an additional $62.5 million from the Inflation Reduction Act to support environmental and climate data collection. President Biden's proposed budget reports an unexpired, unobligated balance of tens of millions of dollars for each fiscal year, in addition to separate line items for additional CEQ funding. In short, this administration is funneling millions of taxpayer dollars to an agency which, at best, as I can tell, its primary goal is environmental justice above all, whether or not the communities impacted actually benefit. Rather than focusing on improving clean air and water in our country by improving the permitting processes and ensuring that NEPA processes are carried out in an efficient and timely manner, CEQ instead spends its time implementing executive orders and rulemaking that vastly exceeds its statutory role and prescribed authority. This is not the first time I've raised these concerns with CEQ or the Biden administration. In February of this year, I invited Chair Mallory to participate in a hearing on the Builder Act, which would provide long overdue updates and improvements to NEPA. Despite this being the landmark law CEQ was created to implement, the Council's leadership made the decision not to appear, answer questions, or provide accountability for their actions. Committee Republicans sent a letter in October 2022 asking CEQ to provide a list of the rulemaking and specific congressional authorities for each rule in light of the Supreme Court decision West Virginia versus EPA. 8 months later, we have yet to receive a response. Our members have also heard numerous concerns that CEQ has directed agencies like the U.S. Forest Service to oppose legislation protecting the use of aerial fire retardant, directly contradicting the scientific expertise of land managers. This repeated silence from CEQ on what they are doing with an unchecked stream of taxpayer dollars is unacceptable. No agency is above accountability, and certainly not one which is grossly overstepping its stated purpose. Chair Mallory, I'm sure that you're aware that as a result of this prolonged silence from your organization and as a reminder of the need for congressional oversight, I asked the House Committee on Appropriations to cut funding for the salaries and expenses of CEQ's senior leadership and set funding levels at reasonable amounts. I genuinely hope that we can have a productive conversation today and get some real answers to the questions we've been asking for months. I believe we share many of the same goals of wanting to protect and conserve our resources wisely, so I look forward to hearing how we can work in bipartisan ways to accomplish this mission. Given the historic permitting reforms recently signed into law as part of the debt ceiling negotiations, I hope to see many more productive conversations on how to continue improving and modernizing NEPA in the future. And again, this is a role of Congress that was delegated to us by the people in the Constitution, that we have checks and balances over the administration. And this hearing is hopefully one that will be proactive, where we can understand what the purpose, modern day purpose of CEQ is, why the vast increase in funding, how that funding is being spent, and what adjustments, if any, we should make going forward. And again, I thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony and the questioning. And I now recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing. Global ocean surface temperatures for April and May of this year were the highest on record. North Atlantic temperatures are off the charts. Experts are ringing alarm bells that have been doing so for some time. However, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are continuing not to listen to the experts, and makes you wonder who they're listening to. Fortunately, Democrats and President Biden have already made historic investments in climate action and our clean energy future through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Those two bills are predicted to cut carbon pollution by 40% by the year 2030. Those investments include $1 billion investment to cut permitting timelines by increasing federal permitting offices' capacity. Interestingly enough, every Republican last Congress voted against it, despite their constant rallying cry on the need to speed up permitting and permitting reform. That could be because they're more interested in reciting big oil's talking points than actually doing anything to invest in a safer, more sustainable future. Today's predictable attacks on CEQ are bound to provide many more examples of that. The Council of Environmental Quality has overseen the development and implementation of environmental policies for more than 50 years. As we look to a future that requires significant new infrastructure for clean energy and meaningful climate solutions, they have a critical and more important role to play. CEQ's FY24 budget request reflects that seriousness of what is ahead and what it's going to take to continue to follow that charge. Chief among the responsibilities, CEQ is currently reviewing and updating NEPA regulations and making sure we are meeting the administration's ambitious environmental and climate change goals. CEQ is also working to set up the new Office of Environmental Justice, created by President Biden's Environmental Justice for All executive order. The office will coordinate EJ policy and strategy across the federal government. This isn't trivial work. The long history of underinvestment and legacy pollution in these communities requires comprehensive systemic change. But rather than support that important work, Republicans are continuing to try to kneecap CEQ by pushing an extreme industry-funded agenda that weakens NEPA, guts key agency authorities, limits community input, and restricts and eliminates judicial review. Not only does this GOP agenda not address our clean energy need, but it also puts our environment and communities even further in harm's way than they already have been for decades. And for what reason? Just so that polluting industries can rack up even more profits more easily and with less restriction. Don't let them fool you. We do not need to choose between protecting communities and building out our clean energy future. We can and must do both. I want to thank Chair Mallory for working in good faith with the majority to be here today. I look forward to hearing their testimony, and I do hope that at this hearing, the majority will not continue to weaponize the oversight and legislative responsibility of Congress in this committee. The crude action on Representative Adam Schiff, the pending impeachment of President Biden, legislating by threat with the debt ceiling hostage taking, the threats of government shutdown, when is a deal not a deal question, and trust becomes a reality in those discussions, conspiracy and boogeyman rabbit hole dives that go on forever, cost money, and don't impact the real needs of the American people, like climate crisis, and personalized and unfounded attacks on representatives of the Biden administration for being here before us and doing their job or with any committee here in Congress. Having said that, I look forward to the testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva. I'll now introduce our witness, and our witness today is the Honorable Brenda Mallory, Chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. And let me remind you that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I'll ask you to please complete your statement. I now recognize Chair Mallory for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of President Biden's 2024 budget for the Council on Environmental Quality. In my role as chair of CEQ, I advise the president on environmental and natural resource policies that improve, preserve, and protect public health and the environment. Under President Biden, we are fulfilling Congress's original vision that CEQ would function as an environmental policy council within the White House, focused on the most pressing environmental and climate change challenges of our time. I'd like to begin by highlighting 3 different areas of CEQ's work: permitting and environmental reviews, environmental justice, and conservation of our lands and waters. Across the administration, we are laser focused on ensuring environmental reviews occur efficiently and serve as effective decision-making tools. President Biden has elevated this issue to the highest levels of government for the first time by forming an Investing in America cabinet that meets regularly on permitting and other priority issues for infrastructure implementation. Last year, the president released the Biden-Harris Permitting Action Plan, which sets forth a strategy for ensuring that environmental reviews and permitting processes are effective. The president has also been working on a bipartisan basis to advance the administration's permitting principles, some of which are reflected in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. In particular, we believe the Fiscal Responsibility Act provides important tools to help agencies use categorical exclusions and programmatic environmental reviews to accelerate permitting timelines for projects that do not have significant environmental effects or where an analysis of effects has already occurred. It also codifies pre-existing accountability measures like timelines and page limits. CEQ is working expeditiously to integrate these changes into our regulations. The Biden-Harris administration believes that every person should be able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and live in a healthy community. During his first week in office, President Biden signed Executive Order 14008, which launched the most ambitious environmental justice agenda in our nation's history. As part of the executive order, we set up the Justice 40 initiative, which seeks to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments to disadvantaged communities. Justice 40 is fundamentally reshaping how the federal government ensures communities that were left behind and underinvested in for decades see the benefits. In April, the president signed Executive Order 14096, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. The new executive order outlines an ambitious approach to environmental justice that is informed by scientific research, high-quality data, and meaningful federal engagement with communities. Finally, I'd like to turn to conservation. CEQ works to conserve important aquatic, marine, and terrestrial habitats while also supporting healthy communities. In his first weeks in office, President Biden launched the America the Beautiful initiative to bring together locally led, voluntary efforts to conserve and restore lands and waters across the country. The initiative's key principles include respecting private property rights and working closely with tribal nations. Its early focus areas include expanding access to nature, supporting the voluntary conservation efforts of private landowners, and safeguarding wildlife corridors and enhancing habitat connectivity. Additionally, this administration has committed to protect historically and scientifically important sites, honor culturally significant areas, and conserve and restore our country's treasured outdoor spaces. The President has been pleased to sign legislation to help protect and restore our public lands and waters. He has also used the authority given to him by Congress to designate 3 new national monuments: Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument in Colorado, Aviquo May National Monument in Nevada, and Kastner Range National Monument in Texas. These and other community-led designations are helping to tell our nation's conservation story and ensure that America's public lands reflect the full diversity and history of America. CEQ is hard at work delivering on the President's commitment to environmental justice, conservation, and building a clean energy economy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to our continued partnership and welcome any questions you have.
Thank you for your testimony, and now we'll move on to questions. And I recognize Representative Stauber to begin the questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for convening this hearing. NEPA was created over half a century ago, and we should celebrate the incredible progress we've made. Today, the United States is the gold standard of environmental protection. Today, Americans breathe the cleanest air on record and have access to some of the cleanest drinking water on record. Frankly, however, much of the progress this country has made is not because of laws and regulations like NEPA, but in spite of it. Over several administrations, both Republican and Democrat, NEPA has grown out of control. What was once a well-intentioned policy to improve our environment has now become a burdensome maze of bureaucracy that is holding our country back and global environmental progress back. Countless regulations and red tape under NEPA make permitting new projects virtually impossible. As a result, we are forcing our energy production, mineral extraction, and manufacturing sectors overseas to countries with minimal, if any, environmental or labor standards. In doing so, we're also shipping away jobs and the economic benefits that these activities could bring. That is why I was proud to support the permitting reforms that were put forth in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, of which you alluded to. This is the first time Congress has made significant changes to NEPA since 1983. While we have a long way to go, these reforms were a good first step in the right direction. Chair Mallory, in your prepared testimony, you state the following: one of NEPA's key functions is to prevent the damage and costs that arise from rushed, biased, and incomplete environmental decision-making. A report from the National Association of Environmental Professionals published last year found that the average time to complete the NEPA process is currently 4.5 years. That's the average. Would you not say it is damaging and costly when the NEPA process takes, on average, and let me stress that, on average, 4.5 years? When much-needed infrastructure projects are no longer viable because inflation has eaten away at the budget initially invested. When investments are flowing out of the country and no longer serving Americans, is that not damaging and costly?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think this administration believes that it is essential for us to make sure that our permitting process is functioning effectively and efficiently, and that we're striking that balance that I referred to in my testimony of having smart decisions that are done effectively, that recognize the importance of environmental protection and engaging the communities. And we've done a number of efforts over the last 2 years that are focused on that. The federal—
Chair Mallory, just because I have a couple minutes left, okay. I appreciate your answer. It is clear that the timelines under the current NEPA process are unworkable. It is possible to conduct proper environmental reviews while still maintaining realistic review timelines for project sponsors. Luckily, the reforms put forth by Republicans in the Fiscal Responsibility Act will help address these excessive timelines by limiting an environmental assessment to 1 year and an environmental impact statement to 2 years. I'd also like to note that these specific provisions were originally included in Republican legislation that was reported out of this committee earlier this year. In an interview last week, Undersecretary of State Jose Fernandez shared the Biden administration's mineral security partnership is currently evaluating committing financial resources to 15 different critical mineral mining projects around the world. These projects are reportedly located across Africa, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Notably, not one of them is in the United States of America. Indonesia happens to be one of the largest producers of nickel, one of the critical minerals being pursued by the mineral security partnerships. Chair Mallory, does NEPA or any other American environmental standards apply to mining projects in Indonesia or other countries?
Congressman, no.
They don't.
No.
I'd like to note that while the United States has significant reserves of nickel, there's only one operational nickel mine in the United States today. Several other nickel mining projects are attempting to come online, including projects in my district in northern Minnesota, but are being held up by this administration. Instead, it seems they'd like to find these minerals elsewhere in countries with subpar, if any, environmental standards. Anywhere but America, any worker but American. That is the Biden administration's motto. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair, I think, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been talking publicly about their plans to continue to use must-pass legislation to attack environmental laws, including NEPA specifically, and the Clean Water Act, like they did during the debt ceiling hostage taking. Recently, Speaker McCarthy's staff said that the House Republicans will continue to take more small bites on NEPA in the future. They have declared that they are going after judicial review, want to impose statute of limitations on lawsuits, and want to make it easier to approve interstate fossil fuel pipelines and require mandatory energy leasing on all federal lands. As part of the environmental justice commitment and the executive order of the Biden administration, and also dealing with the transition issues around clean energy that are so vital to dealing with climate change, how would these actions affect that and affect frontline communities in particular?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the important anchor for all of the work that we're doing around environmental, around permitting, is making sure that we are making smart decisions and putting the agencies in a position to make smart decisions that are effective, efficient, and include engagement from communities. I think as we think about further reforms, and I understand that there are conversations about further reforms, it's important that those reforms not lose sight of that anchor. So any changes that don't allow for the type of environmental review that's necessary, for the engagement of communities that's contemplated, is one that I think we should think very hard about.
The history of NEPA, CEQ, and the creation under that law, and that it's been 15 years, and maybe the time has passed for CEQ, that we've resolved all those environmental issues, that climate crisis is not a crisis, it's just a passing phase. The role of CEQ, the role of that not only advisory capacity, but now kind of the information, the centralizing of those kinds of policy issues across the government and across the country. Its role going forward, 50 years, but going forward, how do you see that role, and has the time passed?
Thank you so much for that question. I think CEQ's role is even more important today than it was 50 years ago because our problems are more complex. The nature of the challenges that we are facing from climate change, among other things, are grave and require that we are working across the government in a whole of government capacity in order to serve those issues. So I think CEQ's role, as you look at the statute itself, very clearly was intended to actually be an agency that dealt with the most significant environmental problems. That's what we continue to do. And each administration has adjusted that in the ways that they think are important. For this administration, climate change, environmental justice, ensuring that we are building out our manufacturing economy, our clean energy economy, those are factors that are critically important.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Rodawagen. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva for holding today's hearing. Thank you to Chair Mallory for your testimony. On March 23rd, President Biden announced plans to expand the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument by designating a new marine sanctuary. The president boasted as if this were a designation review that was ending rather than beginning. This action could devastate the economy of American Samoa, where 80% of all private sector jobs and exports are related to fishing and canning. This is very important to the overall health of my district, and with the committee's permission, I'd like to submit for the record a news article published just this morning outlining how Starkist Cannery employees have submitted a petition opposing the PIRA expansion. The NOAA comment period for this expansion just closed, and I wanted to share some of the key comments that I'd like to align myself with. President Obama's former Assistant Secretary of Insular Affairs, Esther Kia'aina, commented at the NOAA outreach session in Hawaii that you attended in May, that, quote, some federal agencies have shown more concern about the protection of natural resources and ocean resources than the actual welfare and quality of life for the indigenous people who live in these areas. Kitty Simons, Executive Director of the Western Pacific Regional Fishery Management Council, stated that day that, quote, we support the process, but we want to make sure they include fishing in their goals and objectives. American Samoa Governor Maunga stated, quote, American Samoa is repeatedly left out of the conversation of what is best for our communities. We are disappointed that actions could cripple the economy of a U.S. territory would be taken without the consultation of its people. The governors of all three Pacific territories of Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa jointly wrote to the president, quote, we are alarmed and concerned over the prospect of expanding potential fishery enclosures through designating a marine sanctuary. Further closures would be in direct conflict with the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific economic framework and run counter to the principles of equity and environmental justice. Number one, these are just a few of the comments that reiterate the same or similar points. So my question, Chair Mallory, is how does CEQ plan to address these key stakeholder concerns?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the question. The designation or the beginning of the designation process under the Marine Sanctuary process is one that the President sees as fitting into his overall conservation goals under the America the Beautiful framework. That goal and that framework sets as an overall goal of preserving and protecting 30% of the lands and waters by 2030. And this particular designation, if it were to conclude, would be a significant contribution to that overall goal. I think the process, as you laid out, is underway. NOAA has received the comments that have come in, and NOAA's responsibility as part of the sanctuary process is to resolve those issues and to address those issues. So how exactly they will do that, I can't speak to, but the process is robust, and I think that will continue to take in comments from people like those that you suggested and others.
My time is short, and I have a couple more questions which I will submit. But very quickly, with how important fishing access is to our local communities and the need to push back against reliance on foreign goods, is CEQ going to ensure a domestic tuna source? And does the Biden administration support Buy American for Tuna in the school lunch program and our military rations to ensure a safe American supply of tuna for our children and servicemen?
Thank you so much for that question. That is an issue that I think it sounds like NOAA is leading on, and I would defer to them on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chair Mallory. It's good to see you. Appreciate your testimony. As the ranking member of the Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee, I was especially interested in your reference to one of the things the administration is doing that I support, and that is the first ever comprehensive United States Ocean Climate Action Plan. I am eager to work with you on this because I believe that our oceans are central to the conversation about the climate crisis and also could be very, very important to many of our climate solutions. But before we get too far into that, I want to address one of the messy political items that tend to come up in this committee a lot. A few weeks ago, we had a hearing where I believe you were invited to testify. You couldn't be here, but our colleagues had a lot of fun at your expense, suggesting that you were lounging around on beaches in Hawaii and having a good time instead of doing the people's work. My understanding is that you were actually doing the people's work in a very serious way in Hawaii, talking to stakeholders about marine sanctuary policy, something Mr. Graves and I care about. We co-chair the Congressional Marine Sanctuary Caucus. But I think our colleague, Mr. Case, who is not here today, would also probably take exception with the suggestion that anytime people go to Hawaii, they're just having a good time and not doing serious work. You want to tell us what you were doing that day so we can just set the record straight?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. The week that I was spent in Hawaii, I went as part of the launch of the sanctuary process that was just referred to, and I did the kickoff to express the administration's interest in that activity and that process continuing. So I was there for that. I also had the great privilege of meeting with a number of the on-the-ground stakeholders who are taking advantage of the funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to work to put in place restoration projects that have been desired but not afforded for some time. And so had a chance to see how the on-the-ground impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act are really helping communities with their restoration efforts.
All right, it was a productive trip?
It was a very productive trip. I met with a whole range of people, including government members, including the governor himself, and to hear about how we can work in partnership with that community.
Good. Well, it sounds like serious, productive work, certainly the people's business, and that's a lot more than you can say for what typically passes for an oversight hearing in this committee and the subcommittee. So good on you. Could you speak a little more about the Ocean Climate Action Plan and how the Ocean Justice Strategy and National Strategy for a Sustainable Ocean Economy are going to help us achieve our climate goals and promote the blue economy?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for the question. As you know, the 70% of the globe is made up of the water, and so if we are going to actually try to address the climate challenges, we have to be using all of our tools. And we believe that the ocean provides some tremendous solutions to addressing climate change, among other things. We also recognize that in order to make sure that the productive nature of the ocean continues to thrive, that we have to take measures to allow for the resources to function. And so all of that is reflected in the Ocean Climate Action Plan, which is the first that the federal government has ever done. And under that is a climate justice strategy. And the reason for the climate justice strategy, as we've talked about throughout the administration, is we recognize that when you look at climate change, environmental justice communities are hit first and most often. And so we want to make sure, as we're thinking about how we're going to protect our coastlines, how we're going to make sure we take advantage of the opportunities presented by the oceans, that all communities benefit from that. And so we've already started having some great workshops on that issue and hearing from folks about the kinds of things that we need to be considering.
Excellent. And you have done a lot of listening and fact-finding. You were in my district last year or the year before to talk about the offshore wind opportunity we have, which we're very excited about. We've set some ambitious goals there. And you mentioned that you are on the Investing in America cabinet that's working on streamlining. We've got to achieve a lot more high-capacity transmission to fully realize this amazing opportunity in my district and other places. Can you just, in the few seconds I have left, tell us how you're prioritizing transmission in that process?
Well, so first of all, I'm not on that cabinet, but that cabinet is occurring. But we have put
You
in place.
should be in the room, though. I hope you're in the room.
We have put in place a memorandum of understanding across the agencies to take advantage of the existing authorities that we have in the federal government to try to both expedite the process, ensure that we're dealing with the necessary coordination on transmission. And I think there's a recognition, though, that in order for transmission to work more effectively, we do need congressional assistance.
Yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you for being here today. Appreciate it. Are you aware that the majority of projects that are carried out across the country today are not required to go through a NEPA analysis?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I'm aware that projects that do not have a federal intersection would not require National Environmental Policy Act review.
So the majority of projects.
I don't know if that's the majority. I just know that it's not. If the federal government doesn't have a role, the federal government doesn't have a NEPA process.
It's not even close. The far majority of projects carried out across the country today don't have to go through NEPA analysis because of not meeting threshold, such as federal resources. Of course, permitting and other triggers are there as well. Yet we don't see widespread devastation of our environment in the United States because we have a environmental conscience. We have local ordinances, state laws in place that protect the environment and are calibrated to the types of projects that are being carried out. Now, what we've seen under the National Environmental Policy Act over the decades and decades of implementation is we have seen this gross expansion of really procedure, because as you know, the law hasn't changed to the point to where, as the chairman, I believe, noted, our road projects today take somewhere around 7 years to go through a NEPA analysis. And having spent a lot of time working on infrastructure projects in my life, I know it doesn't take anything close to that to build those same projects. The chairman and I worked on legislation called the Builder Act that was introduced last Congress, introduced again this Congress, and that was the basis for the NEPA reforms that were included in the FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Were you aware that Builder Act was the basis for that negotiation and for that law change?
Yes.
Okay. And the chairman and I got to give a shout out to Ashley and on the chairman's staff and Emily and the speaker staff that were integral to this negotiation. But do you appreciate that under that change in law, that there was a significant raising of the threshold to which NEPA applies to projects, and then secondly, a narrowing of the scope of what NEPA actually is supposed to be evaluating?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I think as we look at as we looked at the changes that were made in the in the act. I think our sense is that it's very much in line with the work that we were already doing on in the NEPA program.
If I can interrupt you real quick. So let me be very clear, because I want to challenge that statement. That's a very, very concerning to me to hear you say that. Because think about what you just said. You just said that a statute that was written 40 years ago, because you said you were already doing this. And so I assume you meant already doing it before we amended the law. And so a statute that was written 40 years ago, you're saying that the law changes we just made effectively didn't have an impact because you were already going to do it under the existing law. We amended the organic statute. We amended it to raise the threshold under which NEPA projects apply, meaning that fewer projects NEPA will apply to. And then secondly, we significantly narrowed the scope. And just to clarify, when we narrowed the scope, we also recalibrated the timelines by putting a 1-year cap and a 75-page limit on EAs and a 2-year cap and a 150-page limit on environmental impact statements. That was calibrated with the narrowing of scope that we did under the law. And so I'm very concerned to hear you say that you were already doing this, because that sounds like almost you are going to ignore the changes in law that we just made that were pretty substantial.
Well, first of all, Congressman, let me just assure you, we are not ignoring the changes in the law. We are working now to integrate them into the regulations that exist. What I meant by saying that we were already in line with what we were doing, if you look at the 2020 regulations, some of the things that were picked up in the statute itself were part of the regulations, so it already existed. So in terms of direction, it already was part of the program, and we took steps and are taking steps to make sure that to the extent that there were any differences in the 2020 regs and what the statutory language said, that that's reflected.
Okay, so I want to ask you a direct question. Whenever we narrowed the scope to reasonably foreseeable environmental effects, do you view that as a narrowing as compared to the organic statute?
I do not. We've been doing reasonably foreseeable since the beginning of NEPA. That has been a standard approach to NEPA.
So under Sierra Club versus Marsh, the Supreme Court stepped in and explicitly said that that under NEPA that they should only consider impacts or effects that are likely. Let's see. It says likely need to be discussed, and as in other legal contexts, the terms likely and foreseeable aside the type of environmental impact are properly interpreted as meaning that the impact is sufficiently likely to occur that a person of ordinary prudence would take into account in reaching a decision. That is a significant narrowing of the scope, and I see I'm out of time, so I'm going to come back, but I just want to be crystal clear that having drafted it, having negotiated it, and hearing your response is very, very concerning, and I will tell you, entirely contrary to congressional intent.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes gentlelady from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to thank Chair Mallory for showing up today. I have a couple of items that I would like to enter into the hearing record. One document is titled Examples of NEPA Process for ARA-Funded Activities, and I ask unanimous consent to enter this into the hearing record. Great. And the second is a report on an analysis of NEPA, also from a report to the congressional requesters from the GAO's office. It is, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter that into the record, and I have copies of them here with me.
Without objection, so ordered.
Great. So I do have to say I think that, and words like unprecedented were used, but sometimes unprecedented is a good thing. It means you're showing courage. And I know that other comments were made about sort of you enforcing unscientific agendas being prioritized by this administration. So I just want to know, do you believe in science?
Yes, Congressman, I believe in science. I think that is fundamentally what we are trying to enforce.
Yes. And I also think that it is okay to have legions of advocates who consider themselves justice advocates, because I think our environment actually deserves advocates fighting on its behalf. There are some other things that were also stated in the committee that I'm going to have to come back to, but I'm modulating my innards to make sure that I say things that are allowed to be kept into the record. So, Chair Mallory, can you just please highlight some of the specific investments that have been made so far and how they are making a positive impact?
Thank you so much, Congressman. One of the things I mentioned earlier, that this administration is very focused on ensuring that the environmental protection ecosystem that's been created in this country is one that benefits all Americans, all communities. And so some of the key investments from both from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act include addressing legacy pollution, include making sure that Superfund sites that there's additional money to clean up Superfund sites, dealing with lead in pipes, which is an area in which the president has committed to removing all lead service pipes across the country because we know how toxic that is. Addressing school buses, that electric school buses are now something that we've invested in. I was just in a community last week in which they were so excited because they're getting 28 new electric school buses, and they talked not only about the pollution benefits, but also what that meant in terms of employment in the area, because it was a school that's focused on jobs and also on making sure that they're able to reduce their cost associated with maintenance. We also know that we're doing work on air monitoring, that there are 132 air monitoring grants that have been issued across the country that allow for communities to be able to test what's in their air and whether or not to be able to start the process of addressing what needs to happen in order to make them their health better. So a whole range of things that have gone towards legacy pollution, but are also going towards the energy economy of the future, making sure that we have the kind of improvements in communities all across the country in terms of climate change and reducing pollution.
Thank you. I wish I had time to ask you another question, but I don't. I just want to say I applaud the work that you are doing. I think we do need to be talking about health and the environment of people living in communities across the country, and also the health of our environment. And also recognize that there have been historical inequities and injustices across this country, where certain communities have higher levels of toxicity, and then when there are greater pollutants, and in other communities there are not. And we have to just say it, we have to continue to say it, and we have to speak to it, and we also have to pass legislation and talk about policy to create equities in those spaces where there are grave disparities. And I hope no one thinks otherwise. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is wonderful to be here. Under this administration, we've seen a drastic transition in the CEQ's role. The agency has become heavily politicized, transforming its role from overseeing NEPA compliance issues to waging war against domestic energy production. As the sole representative of the state of Wyoming, a state whose economy lives and dies on energy production and agriculture, I represent the voices of the millions of people who suffer economically at the hands of Washington bureaucrats who seek to expand their regulatory role through radical social agendas. We've seen you, Chairwoman Mallory, prioritize so-called environmental justice rather than focusing on environmental resilience, as the agency supports policies that encouraged increased neglect rather than management. Ironically, we are seeing injustice directed towards vulnerable communities in the name of environmentalism. We're seeing vulnerable citizens struggle to pay their bills due to high energy costs, all while the current administration perpetuates leasing moratoriums on federal lands, stifles American energy production, and increases our dependence on imports. We're seeing federal agencies continue to release proposed rules that lock us out of our lands, hurting not only our energy producers, but our agricultural practices and creating greater uncertainty for the small family farm, while also furthering a housing shortage. The common theme of this administration's energy policy has been an attack on low-income communities, the very people you claim to be protecting. So my question is, do you believe that it is environmental justice to adopt and enforce policies that increase the cost of housing, food, and energy?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I believe that the work that we are doing is focused on a transition to a clean energy economy that will benefit all
So in other
communities.
words, environmental justice has nothing to do with making sure that folks are able to access affordable housing, food, and energy. Is that what your testimony is?
Environmental justice has everything to do to make sure that all communities have the benefits of clean air, clean water, and safe environments.
Chairman Mallory, when you do adopt policies that increase the cost of food, housing, and energy, wouldn't you agree that such policies disproportionately impact low-income communities?
Congressman, I agree that low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by all of the problems in our society, which is why we're trying to focus on those
Including
communities.
policies that increase the cost of food, housing, and energy, correct?
Congressman, I think that all policies, we are working towards making sure that the costs are reduced. That is what the
But that's
president's
not
economic
actually-
agenda.
But that isn't what you're doing. That isn't your agenda. Your agenda actually increases the cost of housing, food, and energy. We know that for a fact.
I think for a fact we know that the costs are coming down, that we are working towards that, and they are coming down.
So you're admitting the fact that they are increasing the cost of those, but
I'm
they're
not admitting anything,
decreasing
Congressman.
perhaps.
No,
Okay.
not admitting anything.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Because this administration has focused on environmental justice, whatever that means, rather than on lowering energy costs and strengthening the reliability of our energy grid, I will soon introduce the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, which will highlight communities who are disproportionately impacted by policies that stifle affordable and reliable energy production. This bill will require the GAO, OMB, and CBO to analyze the economic impacts of legislation and executive actions such as moratoriums, proposed rules, and delays, thus allowing for greater transparency and accountability for the policies that raise energy costs. Chairwoman Mallory, if the GAO report shows that the policies coming from your agency disproportionately increase energy prices, thereby spreading energy poverty among vulnerable communities, will you rescind those policies?
Congressman, I'm sure that the policies you're talking about are not coming from my agency, but we will certainly read anything from GAO and consider it.
Okay, and you've highlighted the President's 30 by 30 initiative with great pride in your testimony. I can tell you, coming from a state where 48% of our surface estate is owned by the feds, none of us are really celebrating the 30 by 30 initiative because we know what it's intended to do to Wyoming. Do you believe that taking someone's ability to generate revenue on their own property is good public policy?
Thank you, Congressman. That is not what America the Beautiful does. America the Beautiful is about dealing with land that is primarily owned by the federal government and working in voluntary ways with communities that want to be part of our system.
Have you read the report where it talks about imposing policies on state and private land?
I've read the report and I know how it functions.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Chair Mallory, it's wonderful to have you with us here today. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about the role of CEQ. I think a lot of Americans aren't aware that the White House has an environmental arm. And as we all know, the vast majority of Americans want clean water and clean air and a climate-resilient future. And so we're especially grateful for the work that you do, helping to advise the president on environmental matters, helping to lead initiatives across the government on all the many environmental issues that our nation faces, and of course to implement the National Environmental Policy Act. And I think it's important to note, since we've been talking a little bit about the history of NEPA here today, that when NEPA was passed by this body in 1969, it was passed on a bipartisan basis and signed into law by a Republican president, in fact, President Nixon. And in fact, NEPA has been the foundational environmental policy on which our nation has built its environmental laws for the last 50 years. And Americans can thank NEPA and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act for the fact that we don't have rivers on fire anymore, and that our children are not being poisoned by refineries and things like that on the scale that they were over 50 years ago. So very grateful for your work. We've had a little bit of discussion here today about environmental justice. I'm always surprised by the coded language I hear, because really environmental justice is about ensuring that every single American, no matter what your ethnicity, what your residency, what your history is in a community, that your fundamental human right to drink clean water, to breathe clean air, to have a survivable and livable future is protected. And I have to say that never in the history of this country have we seen an administration, except for perhaps the Obama administration, more dedicated to environmental justice and that promise to extend the rights of a clean environment to every single human in this country and across the planet, to be a global leader in doing that. And so I wonder, Ms. Mallory, if you could speak to some of the policy initiatives. I know you talk a lot about it in your written testimony, but we haven't gotten to hear more about it today, about the executive order, the tools that CEQ is helping to develop, the Justice 40 initiative, and the ways in which this got baked into the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA to help our communities access resources.
Thank you so much for the question, and you did frame exactly the way that we are thinking about environmental justice and what it does and why it's important. It's important because although we have had this environmental infrastructure for the entire 50-plus years, we know that not all communities have benefited from that. And so we are trying to, in an intentional way, make sure that communities do have the benefit. So the various executive orders that the president has put in place are designed to make sure that we're hearing from communities. We've created the White House Environmental Advisory Council so that there are external experts who are giving us information on how we can improve our programs. We've also, in the executive order that the president just issued, made it clear that we want to look at some of the gaps in science that show that the impacts, that the cumulative impacts in particular that are affecting certain communities, and how we can be adjusting what we do to reduce that harm. The executive order also says that if the federal government is responsible for a toxic release in a community, that they tell everyone. We have a history of not telling everyone, that we somehow tell the wealthier members of a community. We don't tell the low-income members of a community. And so we want to make sure that the federal government does our part in ensuring that that is not true. It creates an environmental justice office, which we believe is really important for managing and helping to implement environmental justice across the federal government. And that office will have the responsibility for helping to create the strategic plans that the agencies will do as they look at their own footprint and how they can improve the environmental justice for communities. So a range of things there, but the fundamental basis is all communities deserve to be protected in this country. They all deserve clean air, they all deserve clean water, and they deserve to know that their government is doing the job to protect them.
Absolutely. And, I represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. I know the chairman represents a district in southern Arizona, and my dear friend here to my left represents all of Alaska, actually. And I think it's fair to say that all of us have communities that have suffered the disproportionate impacts of industrial and resource development without proper notification, consent, and support for cleanup, as well as the impacts of development without their benefits from those activities. But I think the other aspect of this is the consistent underinvestment, especially in our rural and tribal communities. And so the initiatives that the administration is leading to make sure that 40% of our federal resources on the environment get to those communities that have been historically underinvested in is particularly essential to the future of our communities. So we thank you for your leadership on that. As I said, I've never seen an administration, except for the Obama administration, take these issues so seriously, and it really matters for many, many millions of Americans. So thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moylan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Mallory, I represent the island of Guam. It's way out there in the Pacific. It's a long way from the United States. In fact, it takes us 20 hours just to get there. So you can imagine the resources, the cost of these resources that we must pay for our residents and for our military buildup, what it costs to live on our island of Guam. Just recently, we had a super typhoon Mawar come on through that, and now we're rebuilding our island community and we're rebuilding our military there too. So Chair Mallory, our environmental policies can have an outsized impact on my island community. On one hand, I introduced HR 1191 to begin dealing with the harm done to my island and our nation veterans by Agent Orange. Now, on the other hand, burdensome requirements for environmental impact statements can hinder military readiness and artificially hinder the business community, as well as trying to rebuild our island from this super typhoon Mawar. This can suffocate our economy and put my constituents at risk in time of war. Now, does your office take a holistic view of community needs, or do you only look at the community needs from the narrow viewpoint of environmental protection at the expense of other interests?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I really appreciate it. I had the chance just recently when I was in Hawaii to meet with representatives from all the territories and actually heard kind of firsthand some of the unique ways in which the territories actually experience some of these processes. I can say the way that the National Environmental Policy Act is structured, it calls on decision makers to look at the integration of environmental and social issues and how that can impact communities. So I think that's part of the overall process.
Thank you, but again, our cost of living on the island is very high, right? To build our military, to build our island, the cost of tools, resources, what we need is extremely high. These decisions made by this agency have significantly increased the cost of our housing, our food, and our energy as well. It's a great concern with me, but I really would like to affirm my belief that holistic view of community needs should be considered, which includes environmental protection, but does not impair military readiness, which is crucial right now. Indo-PACOM is crucial, or has the impact on our small and mid-sized businesses. So can you commit to working with me to address these issues facing Guam while working from this viewpoint?
Thank you, Congressman, for that. I mean, what I can say to you is that all of the work that the administration has been doing, both some by the administration itself and some on a bipartisan basis, is designed to make sure that our environmental review process is as effective and efficient as possible. I think, as I said, I've heard that there are even more unique issues that are that the territories face, and that Guam in particular may be an example, and I'm happy to hear more about that and to talk to you about what opportunities exist.
I'm really willing to sit down and work with you closely. Like my sister territory, American Samoa, we have some important issues, especially now with our national defense situation, with Indo-Pacific happening. We don't want to let our nation down. And I think these impacts it has to be addressed, American Samoa, myself, CNMI as well, because without making some necessary changes, I don't want to be in that position to report that back to my community. We have a responsibility to do, and while this administration is in place, I want to make sure we have this communication going. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes
Mr. Chair.
the gentlelady from Alaska, Ms. Patola, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chair Mallory. I represent the entire state of Alaska, and we also live and die by petroleum extraction and fishing and tourism. Most of our income for the state comes from oil royalties, but as ratepayers and consumers, we're also paying some of the highest prices for electricity and gas and stove oil in the nation. I was surprised, I guess not surprised. I noticed again yesterday there was a report that came out talking about the state with the highest prices for gas, and it said California is no longer the highest price, it's Washington State. And I beg to differ because I come from a state where some of our communities are paying as much as $15 or more for gasoline and almost $10 a gallon for stove oil. Electricity is very high. I'm very pro-electricity. I've grown up many times, during the time I was growing up, there were many times and most summers where we didn't have electricity. So I really understand what a luxury electricity is. But in my community, the average electric bill per month is about $260 per month. And one of the highest kilowatt per hour communities we have is a neighboring village to my community, and they're paying $396.16 as an average for electricity. Akitan out on the Aleutian Island, their average is $405 a month for electricity. So these are exorbitantly high prices in communities with very high unemployment rates. So we have to really kind of be in a space of trying to balance oil production and energy consumption with recognizing the impact that it has on the world. And I will say, there have been statements about the Willow Project that it's a carbon bomb. And I suggest that most members of Congress live in districts that are a carbon bomb, much, much greater than the district I represent. So I take a lot of umbrage with being singled out for having these projects that are really, so much of the product of those projects is going to fuel these highly populated house districts where their energy consumption is very, very high. So I just recognize that it's going to take us a long time, much longer than I think most people recognize, to transition off of petroleum and using more renewable projects to get our energy. And I feel that most people don't know that it takes just as long and it's just as cumbersome to go through the NEPA process if you're permitting a renewable project versus the same amount of time for a petroleum project. And I know that in the budget negotiation we just came out of for the debt ceiling, there were advances made in streamlining the NEPA process and recognizing we need to beef up our transmission systems. And that's great. It's a step in the right direction, but it's baby steps. And I was wondering if you could talk broadly about how can we be more real and realistic and honest about that transition and the evolution we're going to have to be involved in to get there to more renewables and permitting those in a more timely way.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. As I've mentioned today, I think that the administration from day one has been very focused on making sure that our permitting system functions in a effective and efficient way. That is the combination of making sure that we're meeting the environmental requirements, but also doing it in ways that are smart. And one of the biggest helps that we received in this front was the $1 billion that came in the Inflation Reduction Act for resources. One of the things that people underestimate is what you need in order to actually have the staff capacity and the resources in order to do the permitting that's necessary. And that's been a very big and important role. But we also did, in addition to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, to those changes, we've also had a permitting action plan in place for over a year that is designed to really effectively help with the coordination across the federal government, to make sure that all of the agencies are lining up their processes in ways that kind of facilitate those things occurring in the most timely and efficient way while occurring. We've also been working to create the sector-specific approaches to looking at what are some of the hurdles that people are meeting in the process, and how do we address those? Because just saying that it's going to be faster without actually looking effectively at what are the things that you really need to adjust to make that work is not going to be enough. And so we've already been in that work. Some of the work that we're doing right now in CEQ is making sure that we have a kind of a training approach with our agencies so that they're able to have the right people with the right skill set in order to address these. And then one of the things that in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which aligns with work that we are already doing, is a recognition that we can take better advantage of technology so that the process, it's just the mechanics of the process can be done in a more coordinated way. So I think we, from a lot of different directions, have been very focused on how we make this work as effectively as possible.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairwoman Mallory, you stated in testimony that the agency responsible for implementing NEPA, CEQ, also works to ensure that environmental reviews for infrastructure projects and federal projects are effective and efficient. So the frustration of me and many of my committee members with NEPA will show you that anything that is anything but efficient. And whether we're talking, as my colleague was saying a moment ago, gas and oil projects or renewable projects, and it would seem like when the renewable projects go in, everybody should be celebrating over that, and they run into the same hurdles. So what is the agency's definition of efficient these days?
Thank you, Congressman. And as I keep saying, like we're working on putting these mechanisms in place, and we know that there have already been changes and improvements in the timelines on projects since this administration has been in effect, because we are focused on, at the very highest level of the agencies, making sure that we are engaged on this. Several projects that have been identified to me that range from solar projects to coastal resilience projects, all are showing progress on our completion of environmental impact statements at record timeframes that we think are attributable to the fact that there is earlier engagement, there's earlier coordination with the agencies, there's a regular mechanism for the agencies, all of those that are involved, to work together. And so we're seeing progress, but we're still working.
Let me jump to the next question, please. In the FAST Act, which became law in 2015, we had what was called NEPA substitution, which allows projects to require assessments to forego overlapping requirements, the type of coordination I think you're talking about. In this case, between state and federal assessments that provide that states' environmental standards that are stronger than or equivalent to federal NEPA standards, such as California, which has stronger standards in about everything. This fix, though, was never realized as additional work was needed to implement it somehow. This is, again, 2015, about 8 years ago. So as we already allow for NEPA delegations, this is not an easy and obvious next step in improving efficiency that you're seeking there, removing redundancy. If we have a stronger level at the state and they're doing the work, why wouldn't we have this ability to speed up on the overlapping requirements and assessments?
So the NEPA already allows, and we definitely take advantage of the situations in which there's material or information that's been created at a state level that it becomes part of the process. That is something that exists and has existed, and that we are looking for opportunities to improve.
Okay, appreciate it. Categorical exclusions seem to me a stronger and more important tool in order to get things accomplished, especially with forestry and fire danger from our overcrowded forests. So they've been able to give agencies an ability to speed things up, to more manage effectively. So what we find is that the many land managed agencies are relying upon categorical exclusions to get necessary work done. So if we have the existence of these CEs trying to work around the usual slowness of NEPA, that we're constantly having to fix here. Doesn't that point out that the CEs are doing the work and that the system is not working as intended under NEPA if we have to go to these so-called exclusions instead of what would be the main line of the law?
Categorical exclusions have been part of NEPA from the beginning of the program, and they're focused on areas in which there is not going to be a significant impact. And we are using that tool. In fact, the FRA actually increases our flexibility in using categorical exclusions. We in the agency are looking at different ways in which we can take advantage of categorical exclusions where it's appropriate. And that is something that we do think is something that is helping. And right now, in terms of the number of projects that are actually decided under categorical exclusions, it's 95%.
On my remaining time, I need to ask one more question on when you see projects such as the Klamath project tearing out dams up in the basin there, even though the whole Klamath project was there set up to put agriculture in place, the federal government asked people to settle there and such. Yet at this point, with that, they're saying the economic impacts, well, basically, they're not even being taken into account, how that's harming the counties there, how it's harming the local industry with that. At what point are economic impacts ever going to be brought back into play on decisions like this?
Congressman, I'm not quite clear on what the decision is you're talking about, but economic impacts are among the things that are part of the process.
Well, okay, has there ever been an activity that was stopped by your agency because of NEPA, because of economic impact, that did not go forward?
Well, first of all, that's not the role that CEQ plays. We don't stop projects. I'm not following exactly what you're trying to get.
Stopping an environmental action because of its high cost economically, has the economics of an environmental move, an action, has that ever actually caused pause by any aspect of your organization to say, oh, the economic costs are too high for the benefit derived?
I see. So economic considerations are part of the NEPA process that agencies run.
Okay, I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield my time to Mr. Grijalva.
Thank the gentlelady for the time. Chair, Madam Chair, one of the discussions that was addressed to a great extent in the executive order on environmental justice for all impacts some of the work you do and is a subject that is very much contested. It's a subject of cumulative impact and cumulative effect. How do you see that issue as going forward as we deal with these issues and as communities, frontline communities and others deal with this issue of that cumulative impact? It's not just an isolated permitted industry, it's others that are also part of that.
So thank you so much, Congressman, for the question. I mean, cumulative impacts has been a central part of NEPA since the first regulations were put in place. We look at the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. And what cumulative impacts means is that you acknowledge that when you're looking at a project, that if there are already other air impacts occurring in the same area, that you can't act as if they don't exist. That's what cumulative impacts means, because the way that it's going to be received by the community is they're going to have the impact of the new project, but they're already experiencing the health disparities or health problems from what's already there. And that is very much a part of the NEPA process and has been, and I think will be heightened through the executive order.
Yeah, and let me follow previous questions to you in conversation having to do with kind of the catch-22 for poor people and for frontline communities. The catch-22 being, in order for you to have more investment and more resources into your community, and you won't have to pay more for gasoline, and you won't have to pay more for gas, there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is that you have to adjust to more bad air and the bad health disparities that come with that. And that's historic, that's factual, and it's happened consistently. And that's the legacy that I think with the executive order and the work that the CEQ is doing now with all the agencies is to address that. But let me talk about economic impacts, because that's what the question was alluded to in that catch-22 choice provided to 40 million Americans in this country. Economic impacts. The transition that we're talking about, 2030, 2050, the need to move away from where we're at in terms of what we consume as our primary energy and fuel, away from fossil fuels, and a transition to clean and renewable. That transition can happen in a variety of ways. And let's talk about economic impact. If we continue not to deal with this issue and not approach it pragmatically and with a plan, and that we continue to do what we're doing right now with the majority in this House, is to once again prop up fossil fuel industry if that is the solution to our economy and everything else. Or the transition can be abrupt and very, very brutal, because it'll be upon us and we won't have a choice. Talk about economic impact in those two scenarios. The pragmatism of transitioning versus the abruptness that we will deal with if we don't do anything about addressing the crisis as we go along.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I mean, I think, if you just watch the news and the weather every day we are seeing just increases in extreme weather events occurring all over the country. Yesterday, it was tornadoes in Texas. The days before, it's similar problems. And so what we know is we have a problem that we need to address, which is why the administration and the president is very much focused on ensuring that we're creating this clean energy economy that is necessary. We do have to transition to it. It's not going to happen overnight. It's important that we put those things in place, but the beginning of your question was about how we know that poor people, low-income people, people who are living right on the edges of some of the areas that are most impacted by climate change do suffer more, and they suffer more often. And so they are definitely part of our focus, but it's a much broader need for us to address the climate change impacts that are occurring.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Luna, for 5 minutes.
The Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, was created to oversee agency compliance with NEPA. Like most government offices, the CEQ has expanded its mission beyond the scope of what it was originally intended to do by working to implement radical social change and eco-justice, and I quote, initiatives. This has been seen time and time again since Biden first took office by issuing many executive orders, which President Biden's rule by fiat approach has charged CEQ with ensuring that the radical social change and eco-justice initiatives being pushed by far-left environmentalists become a reality regardless of the negative impact that these decisions will have on Americans across the country. Like all Americans, I believe in protecting our environment. However, environmental protection does not necessarily have to come at the cost of livelihoods of Americans' families through countless executive orders that have done literally nothing to help those people and actually nothing to protect our environment. The Justice 40 initiative was created by Executive Order 14008 to direct 40% of certain federal investments to disadvantaged communities, which are not even properly defined. In fact, all federal agencies must identify programs that fall under the Justice 40 initiative and implement reforms to those programs. Ms. Mallory, would you be able to define what a disadvantaged community is for me?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. The way that we define it is using our climate and economic justice screening tool, which is a mapping tool that actually looks at various criteria related to the burdens that the communities experience and the socioeconomic level. So when you look at the map, it will show you what the communities that we think are disadvantaged and most in need of impact.
What are typically those communities? What do they typically look like on average?
Those communities are actually spread all across the country. They're in urban areas, they're in rural areas, they're in every state. That's the way that the map is set up.
Okay, how can CEQ then which chairs this initiative, direct federal agencies to implement these changes when you guys don't actually properly define what constitutes a disadvantaged community?
As I said, the map defines what a disadvantaged community is, and
guys-
what the agencies do is then look at their own programs that are under the Justice 40 initiative and see how they can
So it's open into
impact them.
interpretation based on
The map
data.
is not open to interpretation.
No,
It's
I'm
a
saying
map.
that agencies, when they implement policy, it's open into their interpretation based on the data that they're given, correct, under Justice 40?
The agencies are using the specific programs that are identified under Justice 40 to apply it to those circumstances.
With the map?
With the map.
With the term that's not defined.
The map is the definition.
Got it. So my next question would be, we saw recently that President Biden wants to build an 8,000-mile train that stretches across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And my question for you is, how are you going to preserve our oceans and protect endangered species when he wants to build this?
I'm not really familiar what you're talking about, Congressman. What
Oh, you
train?
didn't hear that? Did anyone hear that? The Biden 8,000-mile rail that stretches across the Pacific and Indian Ocean?
I think he announced it this week.
Oh, yeah, he announced it this week. I just wanted to see what your perspective would be on protecting marine life with that.
I can't comment on that. I'm sorry, I don't have any details.
Okay. Do you know what resources would take for this to actually be built?
I don't know anything about this project.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Chairman. I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Chair Mallory, for joining us today. You know, I'm from New Mexico, representing New Mexico, but also concerned with Latinos and communities who have been harmed by environmental injustice. So I am very grateful that the administration actually set up very specific criteria to look at. So it is not subjective in the sense like we're pulling it from air, but we are setting up very specific criteria that include what are the health outcomes for those communities that are impacted by pollution, by the results of whether it be in New Mexico, coal mining, coal-fired power plants, or uranium mining, exploding nuclear bombs in our state, which cause cancer. We have very high levels of asthma because the methane leaks. So there are very concrete and observable harm that come from some of these activities that you are now looking at. And I know New Mexico has sadly has a lot of spots on your map. But what I'm also pleased about is that this is not just about what has gone wrong in the past, what are some of our historical injustices, but it's like, what can we do about it? This is about looking for the solution, looking for the answer, and being optimistic about we can solve this if we pay attention to it. And that's what I'm excited about, because we are creating good jobs, we are creating investments, and I want to talk about that a bit. But first I want to talk about the issue of referencing overall benefits going to these communities rather than direct investments, because we know that direct investments actually trigger the benefits. So how do you define and quantify benefits, and how can we make sure that that really does result in real results?
Thank you so much for that, Congresswoman. We are very much focused on how to get to a place where we have the kind of data that will help us assess what those overall benefits are. Ultimately, what we want to be measuring is, does the air get better? Is the water quality better? Are those factors or burdens that are impacting the people's individual health, are those improving? So we have to have a way to actually collect the data that will allow us to do that in the future. As a starting point, we're looking more at what are the ways in which the investments, both direct and indirect, are helping a community that is on our map, whether that is by the creation of training programs or by some of the adding of the electric vehicles. Those are the kinds of things that we're sort of looking at this point.
And I would really like lean in on how investments, because it doesn't happen without the investment. Right. The same way that your work and the work of NEPA doesn't happen without the investments we have made to make sure that there are the professionals on the ground who can do these reviews more quickly. And I think we need to realize that that has always been a problem, and that finally with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the other that we passed, that Congress passed, the president signed into law, finally giving you the tools, which is people power, to get this done. I also would like to enter into the record, the Inflation Reduction Act is building a clean energy economy and good paying jobs, as well as the Clean Energy Investing in America, April 2023, which document a lot of the success we've had in generating investment, generating private sector investment, which actually then leads to jobs.
Without objection.
I want to raise something that is an environmental injustice that is old, but is still lingering we must deal with. In New Mexico, as I mentioned, we actually exploded the very first atomic weapon. We have never compensated the individuals who received the brunt of the fallout. They are called downwinders, and we need to do better by the downwinders who were part of our national security, but were victims of the need for the progress or the fact that we felt it necessary to enter into an atomic age. And I would encourage CEQ. I don't know if they've taken a hard look at that and said, what can we do for these downwinders in New Mexico and in other parts of the country where we exploded above ground nuclear weapons?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm not familiar with that, but I understand that that is an issue and that you're asking us to collaborate on.
Yes, thank you. We look forward to that collaboration. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair Mallory, for being here today. I'm going to focus on the 4 Snake River dams in Washington State. We have a hearing on Monday, a field hearing regarding those facilities, and I'm looking at the Council on Environmental Quality's request for information dated May 3rd of this year, and it reads partially, through the stay agreement, the federal government committed to supporting development of a durable long-term strategy to restore salmon and other native fish populations to healthy and abundant levels, honoring federal commitments to tribal nations, delivering affordable and clean power, and meeting the many resilience needs of stakeholders across the region. That's a general summary of the 2-page request. Would you say that the CEQ wants those 4 dams removed?
Thank you, Congressman, for that. I think that the way in which we framed that statement was to reflect that we understand that there are a broad range of issues and stakeholders who are engaged on this issue in the Pacific Northwest. And I think what we were trying to do is to create a mechanism to hear from all of those stakeholders on what the issues are as they see them and how we need to think about helping the salmon at this point.
My question was, do you want the 4 dams removed? I haven't heard the answer.
Yeah, Congressman, the federal government has not taken a position on that.
It hasn't. And it does say, however, later, in securing the current stay of litigation, the federal government agreed to explore the lower Snake River habitat restoration opportunities, quote, including but not limited to a mitigation corridor restoration through breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams. And then it says, which would require congressional authorization. Do you agree that it's going to require congressional authorization if any of those dams are to be removed?
Absolutely.
And so my question is posed to you in this fashion because Judge Simon, in his previous opinions, hints at perhaps entering orders that would moot the value of the dams through how they might be operated. Are you saying that you would object to that? It says federal government here, but I think it means CEQ. Would you
well,
take
CEQ is not a party to the litigation, so I'm sure that it means federal government writ large.
I'm so happy you raised that. You're not a party to litigation, but you are participating in the in the mediation that is designed to somehow address the litigation, but you're not a party, are you?
We're not a party to the litigation.
But you're leading the mediation. It says so right here in your request for information. So are you saying that you're not part of the litigation, but you are leading the mediation?
I'm saying that the federal government, this is obviously a very complex issue that involves a number of agencies, and we are helping to coordinate. Helping to
You're
coordinate.
Coordinate, so that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah.
So if you tell NIMS and NOAA how it's going to be, they're free to say, I'm sorry, person from the president's office, we choose to ignore you. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think NOAA has its own federal mandate, and I think the way that coordination works in the federal government, everyone comes to the table and we have a conversation about how a particular approach will affect the administration's overall goals. That's the way it works.
I'm just drawing your attention to the third column on the page 1 of the notice. In March of 2022, CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory, Secretary Deb Holland, Secretary Jennifer Granholm, Secretary Michael Connor, Undersecretary Dr. Richard Sinrad, published a blog post reflecting on what the tribe shared at the consultation. You're listed as the first one on this list. I would suggest that must mean something.
Yeah, and what it means is that CEQ is working with all of the federal agencies on this very big and important topic about how do we address the loss of salmon in the Pacific Northwest and actually integrate that into the conversations because there are so many other services that are relevant.
I would just say that in the second page of your notice, the one I read earlier, that there's no mention of the communities that would be harmed should the dams be removed, should the transportation be lost, should the farmers and all those that are trying to get their wheat out of the Northwest be damaged. There's not a hint about that kind of impact, is there? But you're mentioning as though you're concerned about that.
That is what the request is for. It's actually a request for information for people who are affected, who want to weigh in on this process.
Why weren't those groups then invited to this group meeting you had in March of 2022? I mean, you certainly invited everybody else, but not them. And so what I'm trying to get at here, there is a bias reflected here that suggests that those who are interested in protecting the economy in the Northwest should be gravely concerned, and that, of course, is why we're having the hearing on Monday. So those folks will have an opportunity to be there, and I know I just left the room earlier, I'm sorry to have to do that, to go out and have a conversation with the NOAA folks that will be there, and I'm very happy for their participation. I just have 18 seconds left. I just would say that I'm discouraged by the fact that the EIS that was actually initiated during the Obama administration that found that those dams should stay in is being ignored along with some of the science that I hope to hear about on Monday. But that's, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to follow up on that real quick. In regards to coordination, doesn't coordination include local agencies, local governments? Doesn't that include counties, others like that? When you coordinate, it's the establishment of rank equal, not subordinate. I'm hearing from the gentleman from Oregon that it was just federal agencies that were included in this meeting in March of 2022. That's not truly coordination under federal law, is it?
Thank you for that question. I think what CEQ does is it works with the federal agencies, and that is what we were doing. And so our coordination is generally with the federal agencies. The work in the communities that occurs is much broader than that, for sure, and the agencies lead on that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe they're in jeopardy here. If you read federal law closely, coordination is the establishment of rank equal, not subordinate, and that includes local units of government. I would encourage my colleague from Oregon to go back, read this closely as it was written back in FLIPMA and other founding documents in regards to environmental law. And I would encourage him to go to his local units of government and demand coordination with federal agencies because they are supposed to do that. Ms. Peltola had some really good questions, and she referred, some people call the Willow Project a carbon bomb. Do you think it's a carbon bomb, the Willow Project up in Alaska?
That's not my characterization.
Okay. Ms. Peltola also said that it's going to take longer to transition away from hydrocarbons. Do you agree with her assessment?
Well, I'm not quite sure exactly what she meant on timeframes. What I would say that this administration recognizes is that we are needing to transition, and that will take some time. That is clear in the way that the administration has moved forward.
How long will it take?
I don't think that there's a specific time. We have obviously set goals for trying to reach net zero that are at 2050, and that includes a process that will allow us to get there with the transition necessary.
You had an exchange with Mr. Graves earlier in regards to the congressional intent of the NEPA provisions in the FRA, which limits the scope of NEPA to environmental effects that are reasonably foreseeable. You disagreed with him that those provisions limited the scope of NEPA reviews. Are you saying you do not plan to follow congressional intent where the scope is being narrowed?
I said to Mr. Graves, and I say to you again, we will follow the law. I was explaining to Mr. Graves that in the regulations that already exist, that notion of foreseeability existed. But as the law is written, we are going to implement it exactly as it is defined.
That's terrific, because we're going to follow real closely as the Natural Resources Committee in regards to that. The ranking member talked a little bit about various issues, but you alluded to extreme weather events. Have you followed the hurricane data that we've had since the late 1800s, and whether the intensity of hurricanes and the number of hurricanes has increased in the United States?
Well, I know what we've been tracking is the fact that we had for decades, it was typical that you would have these extreme events that were on the order of 7 or 8 a year, and we've now reached a point in the last 5 years where we're having more like 18 different events that cost over $1 billion. So that there is an increase in the extreme weather events that are occurring that are costing the federal government over $1 billion.
I would encourage you and your staff to look at hurricane data, because it's actually more intense hurricanes prior to 1950 than it is currently. What many people suspect is that due to so many people having moved to coastal areas that did not previously, my wife's grandfather used to go to Fort Lauderdale in the early 1900s before they even had a stoplight in Fort Lauderdale. So many people have moved to these hurricane-prone areas that might be part of the reason that is going on. We've heard the doomsayers in regards to climate change. We had a vice president who claimed in 2007, in 10 years, man will be threatened and will not be able to inhabit Earth. That passed in 2017. We're just celebrating the 5-year anniversary 2 days ago by the climate activist, Ms. Thunberg from Sweden, where she said in 5 years, the life on Earth is threatened and probably will end. That 5 years expired 2 days ago. Do you subscribe to that kind of rhetoric that the world is about to end because of climate change?
I think what we are actually focused on is the scientific evidence that has been put out by numerous scientists, including the IPCC, on the way in which climate change is progressing, and that's what we're trying to address.
So as we move to intermittent sources of power, do you agree that we should continue to destroy productive farmland as happening throughout America, including in my state of Wisconsin?
I think that there are a number of different tools that are being used to address climate change across the country, and it's important for us to weigh all of them.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Mallory, under a recently proposed rule which your office was heavily involved in drafting, all major federal contractors would have to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and set emission reduction targets that must be validated and approved by an international non-governmental organization known as the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI. In effect, you have outsourced government responsibilities to an outside foreign entity. SBTI has received criticism by some who argue there is an inherent conflict of interest in both setting emission standards while also charging customers a fee to validate their emissions reduction targets. Why did CEQ decide to select SBTI as the sole source provider of emission reductions targets?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I mean, that rule is part of the administration's leading by example by ensuring that our federal government and
I ask, why did they decide to select SBTI as the sole source provider?
What I'm saying is how we got to this point. The rule is designed to help make sure that we're implementing the climate goals across the federal government as well. And that rule was picked to actually figure out a standard that could be used that would be help to ensure that we are approaching that, the work and the climate
I'm just
work
trying to figure out why
appropriately.
you decided to go with a foreign entity.
I think that the rulemaking is picking on an entity that is actually well-known and
So
has
was
a
a competitive
standard.
process used in selecting SBTI as the sole source provider of emission target validation? Was there a competitive
This
process
is a
used?
this is a rulemaking process that is under discussion now. That is we're taking comments.
Let me ask you this, were other agencies or nonprofits considered?
It's a rulemaking process under discussion
Is
now.
that the only one that was considered?
I don't know the answer to that.
Goodness. Since SBTI is not a U.S.-based, how will you ensure that they are not acting on behalf of a foreign power to negatively affect the U.S.?
I would say, Congressman, if you have comments along these lines, please submit them.
This is a question.
And I'm saying, I don't have the answer to your question, but please submit the comment.
Goodness gracious. Why didn't CEQ select a U.S.-based nonprofit to vet the emission standard set by contractors?
Congressman, I have no further comments on this rule.
All right, well, let's shift gears a little bit then. Are you aware that a report by the New Climate Institute determined that several of SBTI's emission assessments were contentious or inaccurate?
I have no further comments on SBTI.
Are you also aware that one of SBTI's founders has accused them of having several conflicts of interest and of putting their own interest above the interests of the public?
I have no further comments on SBTI.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess that I'll yield back the balance of my time then.
Would you like to yield your time to Mr. Graves?
Yes, sir. I would yield the rest to Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Appreciate the yield there. Madam Chair, I to say I was a little bothered by your comments earlier would be a pretty significant understatement. I've already reached out to White House about the negotiators that we worked with on negotiating debt ceiling. I'm really confused. So you're sitting here telling me that all of the rewrite of NEPA that we did, we effectively were just working to come into compliance with what you were already doing. Is that kind of what you're?
Congressman, that is not what I'm saying. When you were asking a question about the standard, and I was simply trying to explain that it was directionally picking up on a number of the things that we have as part of the practice that NEPA has been implementing for some time. You use the specific language, reasonably foreseeable. Reasonably foreseeable is a standard that has been applied in NEPA for some time. So no, there definitely this was the first time that NEPA has actually been changed in statute, no question. That some of the provisions are new to NEPA, no question, and we are going to implement it.
Madam Chair, I specifically asked you if you saw that as a narrowing. We explicitly narrowed the scope of environmental review and put time limitations and caps on documentation and everything, and you effectively said that you didn't see it that way.
I didn't see reasonably foreseeable is not narrowing.
Why we're even here? Why are we even here if you're just going to do whatever you want to do?
Congressman, I did not say that. I have said 3 or 4 times today that we are going to implement that statute as it was directed. And all I'm saying is that the words reasonably foreseeable are words that have been part of the NEPA program. They have been part of the NEPA program. They are now in the statute. That's the change. They're in the statute.
I'm out of time, but I can't wait to talk about this some more.
Gentlemen's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Hunt, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, ma'am. I really appreciate it. A little bit about me, born and raised in Houston, Texas. The entire energy corridor is in my district. If Houston is kind of loosely known as being the energy capital of the world, I kind of fancy myself as being the energy congressman of the world, ma'am. So this is kind of my jam. This is kind of my bread and butter. It's something that I take very seriously because I think there are a lot of issues that we've seen in this administration that doesn't necessarily approach this in a way that's the most beneficial for the American public and for the American people. Now, I think there's a bit of an ideological difference as well. I think that the people on this planet are the most important thing that we got. somebody that has 3 small children. I have a 4-year-old daughter, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I have a 6-month-old little boy. Nothing on this earth is more important to me, and nothing is more important to their lifestyle and what we do moving forward. I spoke to an offshore oil company that operates in the Permian Basin. They explained to me that this month they had 122 overdue permits. And over the past 3 years, that's basically their pending time, 122. And that's kind of problematic because we've seen a lot of energy and oil and gas crises that could have been mitigated, I feel like, and this cost and this price is being pushed down to the consumer. FERC also approved the Rio Bravo liquefied natural gas pipeline permit on April 20th in 2023. This also took over 3 years, and it happened because many members on this committee wrote numerous letters and badgered FERC concerning it, and we finally got it done. And when it's fully operational, it's going to transport 4.5 BCF per day, which I think is very good. The American public needs this because we're getting ready to get on our cars and go to Disneyland and drive all over the country, and we need a break. The American public needs a break, and we have got to have these capabilities sooner than later. My question to you, ma'am, is oil and gas important to the future of this country and to the future energy of this country?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think, as you know, that the administration is very focused on addressing the urgency of climate change and recognizes in doing that, that as we move towards what we believe to be a clean energy source that will reduce the carbons, that we are transitioning away from oil and gas. So yes, it is in the future, unquestionably in the future, but it is part of the transition and the change.
Do you think climate change is a global issue?
Global issue, yes.
You think it's global? Okay, so would you agree that the gains that we might make in reducing our carbon footprint in one region of the world, let's say the United States, juxtaposed to maybe the increase in our carbon footprint in, let's say, China, do you think that what happens in China would offset our gains here in this country?
I think, Congressman, I think that we are very focused, and the president in particular is very focused on making sure that we are recognizing our own leadership role to manage what we do as we continue our negotiations with other federal, with foreign entities about the approach that they're taking. I think this country is very focused on the fact that China has some advantages to the United States in some of the areas that we work, and that we're trying to position ourselves so that we can actually continue to have this country lead on areas that we think are important.
So I think we're leading. So right now, the United States is roughly 13.8% of the world's carbon, and we've been declining for every single year of the past decade, with the exception of one. But by the time we get done with this conversation, China is going to build another coal plant. They're increasing their refining capability while we are reducing ours in this country. I understand the idea of wanting to look at this through rose-colored glasses and say, oh my gosh, yeah, we're going to lead from the front, they will follow. But it's my humble opinion that China, India, for damn sure Russia, they don't care about climate. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't do our job to get better and cleaner and safer? Of course we should. I think it's actually kind of the American way. But as I stated earlier, there are literally hundreds of companies that are in my district, in the energy corridor, and I visited almost all of them, and not a single energy or oil and gas executive has said anything disparaging about renewable energies moving forward. In fact, I'm kind of sick and tired of hearing the word transition, because that's a lie to the American people. There is not a transition happening. It's addition. It's going to be a mix. And oil and gas and energy are going to be a huge part of it. And my concern is that we as a federal government should not be picking winners and losers if we are not going to consider the global implications of everyone else that doesn't care about the climate as much as we do. And we should be putting our children and our future and our economy ahead of anything else, or else we're not going to be here in the future. And with that, I yield back my time. And thank you for being here, ma'am. Greatly appreciate it.
When his time's expired, the chair recognizes Mr. Magaziner for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Chairman, for the recognition. I just want to say the important work of the Council on Environmental Quality cannot be overstated. And the attacks on the council are just another attempt, unfortunately, to put polluters over people. The Council on Environmental Quality exists to protect children, seniors, and everyday people by ensuring that the air we breathe and the water we drink are safe. Kids can only live happy and healthy lives if we keep dangerous chemicals out of the water and air. And the advances we have made since the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which created the Council on Environmental Quality, are incredibly important. Since NEPA was enacted in 1970, we have reduced emissions of dangerous pollutants by 78%. 700 billion pounds of pollution have been diverted from Americans' waterways annually since the 1970s. Cleaner air has led to higher achievement by students and fewer workdays lost to illness. And those effects are magnified in the lower income and historically marginalized communities that have too often had to bear the burden of worse air and water quality. So indeed, protecting our environment is key to the long-term sustainable growth of our economy and helps achieve more equitable outcomes. And if this committee doesn't prioritize protecting clean air and water, we are compromising the health of future generations and holding the American people back from achieving their full potential. So make no mistake, the real issue in this hearing is not CEQ's small budget request. It is, unfortunately, an attempt by some of my colleagues across the aisle and their big corporate donors to undermine the Council's ability to protect our air, our water, and our climate. We must confront the challenges that cause timelines of project approvals to grow, particularly lack of agency staffing. However, undermining the agencies responsible for protecting our environment is not the solution. We have to support the Clean Water Act, we have to support the Biden administration's American the Beautiful Act, and the Justice 40 initiative. And short-sighted attacks on the Council by some of my colleagues across the aisle will only compromise our ability to appropriately protect the air and water quality and public health that our communities rely on. And will stall our transition to a clean energy economy, which is absolutely essential. So my question for you, Chair, is for our constituents back home who don't know what the Council is, who don't know what NEPA is, can you just explain once again how the work that you and your colleagues do helps protect our constituents and the quality of their air and water in particular?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I think, as you alluded to, the council was created specifically to advise the president and the president's advisors on environmental and natural resource issues, and in particular on those issues that were kind of most significance for our country. And so we actually work across the federal government on policy issues that are of importance to the American people. We are helping to try to coordinate our activities in ways that will ensure that what actually happens on the ground is done in a consistent and an appropriate way. And so as Chairman Carper likes to say, we are like the conductor, kind of helping that symphony to play. There are a number of different roles, but we want to make sure directionally that they're going in the same direction. And so, like, for example, on the environmental justice work that we have been focused on, we've been helping the agencies as they are implementing the incredible resources that we've gotten from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to actually see changes on the ground made to people's lives.
Thank you. And I just want to give one example. The NEPA process led to the discovery and the remediation of harmful chemicals at a site now occupied by the Providence Community Health Center. And so, when we talk about NEPA on this committee, we often talk about the permitting process, the review process, the paperwork involved, et cetera. And we want to streamline things in a responsible way. But this is just one of thousands and thousands of examples from around the country of how the NEPA process has not only remediated dangerous chemicals in an urban area, but has made it possible to open a community health center, which again is serving the community and making people healthy. We could go through example after example, but I don't want it to be lost in this conversation that the NEPA process is valuable in protecting children, seniors, families from environmental degradation and unlocking the possibility of community development all across our country. So with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And I'll recognize myself for questions. Chair Mallory, thank you again for being here. For years, CEQ has operated with a budget of about $3 million. The president's budget request bumps that up to $4.8 million. And on top of that, in the IRA, CEQ received $62.5 million. We have requested information from CEQ before, and you failed to deliver it. So instead of asking you to explain your budget numbers, I'm asking you to submit a written report to the committee outlining the justification for that increased budget request, how you're spending the $62.5 million, if you've added new employees, if you've expanded programs, and I would just ask you to comment yes or no if you will send the committee that information.
Thank you so much for the question. I think we'll coordinate with you on how to accommodate that request.
Thank you. And also, it's been brought up in the testimony today that it seems that there's been mission creep with, or in the testimony and the questions, there's been mission creep on CEQ's original advisory role to the president. It appears that CEQ now coordinates and directs agencies on directions to go, and also new roles that CEQ's taken on with environmental justice, with carbon mitigation, things that definitely weren't perceived in the original NEPA law. But it also appears that this administration and CEQ is failing in many of those stated areas that they list as concerns. And let's talk about environmental justice. Is it environmental justice for U.S. policies that require us to transition to electric vehicles, which means we've got to have more batteries, which means that we're not mining the materials here, and we're mining them from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I looked it up, the U.S. average income is $58,120, China's $16,153, India's $1,670, and the yearly average income in the Congo is $449 US. Is it environmental justice to push policy that requires, it's resulting in Chinese slave labor in mines in Congo? Is that environmental justice?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think we are very focused on advancing our own ability to do critical mineral mining here in this country. That's part of the president's
agenda. The actions
agenda.
of the administration have been just the opposite, pooling leases in northern Minnesota, trying to shut down mines in Arizona. But I will say that I read an interesting article in the AP yesterday where a young Native American woman stated that a mine that this administration pushed to open in Nevada, she used the term green colonialism. Do you believe that's achieving environmental justice when Native Americans are calling this administration's actions green colonialism?
I think we're trying to manage our actions in a very balanced way in order to achieve the president's overall goals.
You've also talked about energy transition. The gentleman from Texas, I think, delved into this. This chart behind me shows the global consumption of energy by fuel source over time. And as you notice, every form of fuel consumption is increasing, and it's on an exponential increase. And I agree with the gentleman from Texas. There is no transition. And you've also talked about the, you mentioned electric school buses, and I found it interesting that the League of Conservation Voters touted the green school bus program as a victory for them. Did you consult with the League of Conservation Voters on the electric school bus program?
I have not consulted
Have
with
you
them.
consulted with any outside NGOs or nonprofits on any of your policy issues?
Congressman, we actually hear from many members of the public on all of the things that we're doing.
Would you be willing to send us a list of the NGOs and people that you've met with regarding any of these policies?
Congressman, I think we should have a conversation about what you're actually looking for. We'll try to figure out how to accommodate it.
Okay. Well, my time's almost expired, and there's been request for a second round of questions, so we're going to move along to that, and I recognize Mr. LaMalfa for his second round of questions.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for that opportunity, and we appreciate the time as we live in these little 5-minute compartments around here, which is sometimes tough to deal with. So, ma'am, I wanted to follow up on the question as we ran out of time last time. On the economic impacts of a decision, of a NEPA action or CEQ, what it might be. So when we take the Klamath Basin, for example, a strong agriculture area that project was created in order to foster a new agricultural zone in top of California and part of Oregon. And so it was encouraged by the federal government in development of that project, many years ago. And now it's deemed that their existence, that those farmers, those families are a threat to the environment by what they do and the water that they use. So when we talk about the economic impacts of an action taken under NEPA, under CEQ and other environmental rules, whether it's NOAA or U.S. Fish and Wildlife, seems that the economic impacts are not getting the weight that they deserve, as my interpretation is prescribed by the law. So I want to return to that question. Do you know of an instance where, if, as you said, economic impacts are somehow taken into account, has there been an activity that has gone so far in the economic cost versus the benefit that it actually has stopped the enforcement of a water for fish or stopping of a hydroelectric project or whatever it might be? Have you seen where the environmental action has actually been stopped and because of that economic impact?
Congressman, I think the important function to remember about NEPA is that it is a mechanism to get information that the agencies then use to make their decision. And the decision is based on the programs that they are evaluating. So I don't think there's no chronicling of the question to provide the answer for you in the way that you're framing it.
Well, NEPA, many of our opinion here, has been weaponized in order to stop projects, but also take away existing projects, such as the dams make hydroelectric power in Klamath and others that are in line, the Snake River up north. And so do you see a threshold, just to walk away from that specific, do you see a threshold for CEQ or federal action to, whether it's save species or what have you, would actually make the area unlivable for the people that live there, whether it's agriculturally, as residents, as we're seeing with folks that are losing their homes in the Klamath area I'm talking about? Is there a threshold that CEQ would identify economically or just the effect on people?
The way that the CEQ regulations that the agencies apply works is that it allows for the collection of information that they then evaluate in the context of their programs.
So you lay it this merely collection of information?
NEPA is about collecting the information that is on the topics that the agencies then evaluate.
Okay, so in the timeline of collecting the information and assessing it and making it ready for interpretation, it seems to take a very long time, and that in of itself has a great economic and harmful impact on people that are dealing with that. What do you see that timeline should actually be, especially since we talked about categorical exclusions in order to move around the onerous work needs to be done on simple things like timber harvest projects and such after a fire?
So as you know, the law that was just passed actually creates some creates some timelines that are focused on the environmental review process. My own view is that it's really important that as we're doing the review that we make sure that we have the time to do it and that we make sure we have the staff available to meet those timelines so that the FRA
okay. Well, it doesn't happen
includes
now, so let me ask this lastly here. When you're looking at these takings of whether it's land, the water to go with the land, and other aspects that opens up the federal government to lawsuits, and the costs to the taxpayers of lawsuits. Do you take that into account as part of an economic impact when you see that there will be lawsuits, such as on the Klamath, where the water has been taken away, will negatively affect homes and agriculture and such, and lawsuits will come? Do you take lawsuits as part of your economic impact into account?
So just to be clear, CQ does not do an economic impact. These are actions that are done by the agencies. We don't do an economic impact. The agencies do the impact analysis.
All right. Do you believe they should be taking greater role? Economic impact should be a greater role with those agencies as you see them happen.
I think the agencies are balancing their analysis based on what their statutes require.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These hearings are always an interesting adventure, so I've appreciated the discussion and Chair Mallory, your intelligent, calm, cool, and responsible answers to many of the wild and interesting questions that we've gotten here today. But I do feel compelled to just do a little bit of cleanup here on some of the misinformation that we've heard here today. I want to just start with global climate change and energy transition. I heard some statements here today about there's no energy transition happening, that if we just could get China to stop its emissions, then the US wouldn't have to address its emissions. I mean, first of all, Chair Mallory, does the United States have jurisdiction over China?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, we don't have jurisdiction over China, but I think that China is actually an area, and the fact that they are dominant in some areas is something that the administration is very focused on. And so that we, too, as we think about how we shore up our own economy, are focused on putting ourselves in a position so that we can actually, do our own critical minerals here. That's important to the administration.
And in terms of talking about the overall global climate footprint, and both in terms of emissions and in terms of reducing emissions, the United States per capita is one of the largest emitters per capita in the entire world. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
So the United States has a fundamental responsibility, especially on the global scale, of addressing our emissions across every single sector. And that is, once again, why we passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, because it takes each of these emission sectors, sector by sector, and tries to address those emissions. Now, in terms of some of the questions about whether or not that is environmentally just, whether or not that has implications for the future of our communities, 1,000%. Of course it does. We're talking about the future of our planet. And while I greatly respect every community that depends on resource extraction for their livelihoods, we will not have a planet that is livable if we do not address global climate change for any communities. And so the transition is occurring. It will occur. It will continue to occur over the next decade, over the coming decades. And if we are effective in implementing the policies that this body last Congress passed with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the policies that the Biden administration is implementing, with the global leadership that the Biden administration is working on in partnership with other sovereign nations, including China, including other countries, then we will avert a global climate crisis and we will have a survivable planet. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, what our goal is. Secondly, I want to address this issue of mission creep. There's been some misinformation shared this morning in many different sort of compartments of the conversation. But when the National Environmental Policy Act was passed by this body in 1969, Chair Mallory, wasn't it partly the intent of Congress to have an entity that sat at sort of the tip of the spear in the federal government that could coordinate across agencies on environmental review and protection?
That's correct.
So, Mr. Chairman, that is entirely the point of why Congress created the Council on Environmental Quality. So some of the assertions we heard today about mission creep, expansion of the role, are just actually factually untrue on the basis of the statute that we passed, that Congress passed on a bipartisan basis. And I also want to note that we do have a separation of powers, and that the president, under every administration, has the right and authority to create an advisory body within the executive office of the president that can advise advise that president on any matter. It can be statutory, or it can be something that the president creates because it's part of carrying out their mission. So some of those arguments are just untrue. And finally, with the remainder of my time, I do want to just say I've heard a lot of unusual arguments today about NEPA, and I think that it's very clear from what happened in the inflation reduction, in the debt ceiling limit negotiations that happened, that there was a very clear intent to hold our country hostage and to do so over a key few items. One, to try to cut federal spending and the spending in our agencies. Two, to gut our environmental laws. And three, to gut our social programs. And there was a very crafty and clever effort to undermine the National Environmental Policy Act. And I believe that many of the comments here today were intended to set legal traps for the entity that administers the National Environmental Policy Act. And I just want to say, Chair Mallory, I am grateful that you are in that role. You are exactly the right person to be there defending NEPA, and we will continue to fight these efforts to undermine NEPA. Thank you.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Grijalva.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for being with us today, for your responses. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter into the hearing record that touches on the issue of energy poverty that we heard about today. In April of 2020, at the start of the COVID pandemic, 11 former and current Republican members of this committee publicly asked oil-producing nations to cut the global oil supply for the express purpose of reversing, quote, a drastic price drop affecting the bottom line of some oil and gas companies. This request to lower production to increase oil and gas prices for consumers came at a time when millions upon millions of people were losing their jobs monthly, and millions could not afford those higher prices. This is unfortunately one of the many pushes to benefit gas and oil companies that my Republican colleagues have undertaken to drive up energy costs. And the discussion today is also part of that. As my colleague from New Mexico rightly pointed out, in those discussions to avoid the cliff of the debt ceiling crisis, NEPA was a top item. And the consequence of that is that, some of us supported that. I did not support that deal because of the direct beginning process of dismantling NEPA, what it stands for, and what it could potentially stand and needs to do in the future. And so my only comment, with all due respect, Madam Chair, and directed as you provide feedback back to the White House, that there are going to be other opportunities for my colleague, whether it is attempting through legislation, through the gutting of your budget, through other things, to continue to go after NEPA and the role that CEQ plays for this country and for the White House. To advise the White House, at least from my perspective, that if a deal is not a deal, and we continue now and must pass legislation keeping the government open, in the budget discussions and decisions that have to be made down the line, if we continue to see negotiations centered on undermining, dismantling, and effectively crippling the role that CEQ needs to play now and in the future, in the three areas that you outlined today, or that the opposition to those kind of deals, at least on our side, will continue to increase because the threat is real, the efforts are ongoing, and we are very concerned that as negotiators for the White House, in direct contact with the majority here in the House, continue to put NEPA on the table and to sacrifice that protection for the American people is something that it is going to be very difficult to tolerate, and more members are going to come to that same conclusion. I have nothing else to add other than my profound thanks, Madam Chair, and yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and I recognize myself, looks like, for the final round of questions. Thank you again, Chair Mallory, for being here today. There's been a lot of talk about the debt limit bill, the FRA, and the, quote, gutting of the bedrock environmental laws. Do you believe the changes to NEPA passed in the FRA were gutting NEPA or adversely affecting NEPA?
Thank you so much, Congressman, for that. I think that ultimately the way it ended up, as I was trying to explain to the other congressman, is very much in line with some of the measures that we have been using
So you support the changes we made to NEPA?
I think that we can work with them. We can work with them.
Did you advise the president during the negotiations that these were acceptable changes to NEPA?
Congressman, I'm not going to get into any advice that occurs in the White House.
Do you have an implementation timeline on the NEPA changes?
We are working actually quite diligently to make sure that the changes get integrated into the rulemaking that we were working on.
Thank you. I would just note that the FRA passed by a huge bipartisan majority in the House and the Senate, and President Biden signed that, and it is effective immediately. So I would hope this would be a #1 priority for you and the other federal agencies to implement these laws, and that we would see the benefits happening immediately. Also, you've talked about scientific evidence a lot in your testimony and in the questioning, yet I find it discouraging that, along with science goes math, and let's look at electric vehicles. There's been a lot of talk about EVs. In the justification for CEQ's actions on EVs, what would it lower greenhouse gas emissions if we could make every passenger car and light-duty vehicle in America an EV overnight? Do you have those numbers?
I don't.
Do you have a general feel for it?
Someone does. I can circle back with you on any numbers.
I would like to see those numbers, because if you do the math, it's actually less than 1%. And I would gladly accept the challenge to that number if you have different numbers. Also, CEQ, in a report that the Forest Service and the BLM released complying with an executive order from the White House, the agency stated that, quote, the role of place attachment or identity, meaning the symbolic importance of a place, is a repository for emotions and relationships that give meaning and purpose to life, may also be particularly relevant in our understanding of how people relate to and value old-growth forest. If that sounded confusing to you, welcome to the party, because I can't understand what that means. I asked Chief Moore what it meant in a hearing, and I don't think he understood what it means. And can you tell me in 30 seconds, just summary, what is old growth?
I think old growth are the oldest forests and oldest trees that we have in this country, and there is a range of timelines that people use to refer to that.
Was that defined in this report?
I actually don't know the report you're talking about.
Old growth, which it has no relevance or meaning unless you're talking about a specific forest type, and even then it's questionable as to what old growth is. How much input does CEQ have with our federal land agencies on the actual management on the ground? Because to me, this is very confusing directives that come out in reports like this that leave federal land managers in a quandary. And we've seen an exponential increase in forest fires. We've lost 20% of our giant sequoia trees to catastrophic wildfire. And if you look at a climate perspective, forests are, I've said this over and over, they're the largest scale, most economical, quickest way to remove carbon from the atmosphere, far exceeding any kind of technology that's been invented. Yet we seem to be implementing policies that are causing our forests to burn even faster than they've burned in the past. So I'll give you a chance to respond to what CEQ is doing working with our federal land agencies to actually make our forests more healthy and resilient, which also means not only clean air, but clean water, better wildlife habitat, and a lot of access for recreational opportunities for the American public.
Thank you for that. And I guess I would just start off by saying, you know, that we look at all of the work that's going on in terms of the climate change and addressing climate change as being important. So no one activity, not just the electric vehicles, it all has to be taken together. And on the forest, I guess what I would say is that we, you know, the partnership that exists across the federal government between CEQ and the other agencies is designed to kind of help with addressing some of the overall issues and challenges. We have actual sector groups or task forces that are actually looking at wildfires as a really important, one of the really important areas where we have to have coordinated management on how we're addressing that. And also recognize it is actually one of the significant areas that needing attention. We've had work that the agencies have been doing to try to actually make sure we have the support for addressing the wildfires that are occurring, and that we have actually different categorical exclusions that are in place to actually help with the management area. So I think we recognize it as being one of our big challenges. It's obviously one that is having a significant impact on not only on the ecosystem, but on all of the communities that are so close and affected by that. And I think that is part of trying to make sure that we have the tools necessary for the agencies to address the problems.
And I would just point out that recognizing and doing are two different things. And policies like this old growth policy, policies on locking up more federal lands, policies like the Chaco Canyon withdrawal, these are not helping management in any form or fashion. And again, I thank you for your testimony today, and I thank the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions, me included, for the witness, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on June 27th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.